you're ready, and we will get started.
Great. Cool. So hi, thanks for having me here. My name's Charlotte. I'm the founder of Know the Origin. So we're basically a marketplace or a collective of 130 different ethical brands that all have amazing social and environmental impacts. So everything from coats made out of recycled bottles to socks that every pair is sold, a pair is given to a homeless person within a few miles of where they're sold, to like plastic-free products to fair trade fashion. We have quite a mix of products and brands that we work with. So I thought I'd just start by telling you a little bit about my journey and kind of how it started. So I, 5 years ago, was studying at London College of Fashion, and I spent sort of 6 months working on a project in Tanzania with some incredible women out there that had basically chosen or had previously been trafficked or chosen to leave prostitution. And it was a skills-based project, just trying to understand and see the transformation that could happen through supply chains being used well. I then was asked to work on a similar project in Zatari refugee camp. And while I was there, there was basically garment factories being built just outside the refugee camps because they were going to where people were most vulnerable, didn't have sort of ID or a way of, basically most vulnerable, and didn't have like full rights or protection, and exploiting people for cheap labor. And I think just seeing that, you know, someone had actually sat in a boardroom and thought, this is a really great decision, this is where we can like grow our business for exploiting people, I think just really, I just think is outrageous. I think it's outrageous that in 2020 we're still sort of, when we have the most technology and education, that we still can't make clothes without exploiting people. While I was in my second year at uni, the Rana Plaza factory collapsed in Bangladesh. There was over 1,100 people that died in this factory collapse, and over 2,500 people that were trapped in the rubble. And whilst I would love to say this was a one-off disaster, this was a fully preventable factory collapse. In that one area in Bangladesh, there's been over 100 different instances, factory fires. So this is a problem that is rife and reoccurring. I was studying buying and merchandising, so kind of how you create a product and the processes behind our clothes. And I had never really stopped to think about the actual impact of the people that were behind the clothes, despite working in the fashion industry. So I think that just shows you like the lack of sort of connection in the products that we make. At the moment, 61% of brands don't know where their clothes are made, and 93% have no idea where the raw materials come from. I think the fashion industry runs on an incredibly complex system where there's often sort of hundreds of people involved in the process of making one cotton t-shirt. So it's really challenging. When the Rana Plaza factory collapsed, I was working at ASOS in their buying team, and I think a lot of my fellow students on the course were also working for other high street retailers that were all panicking. Are they making stuff there? And I think it's that lack of connection and knowing where things come from. So I wanted to work for a brand when I graduated where I could be sure on where things were actually coming from. And I looked at what was out there, and there was a lot of either super expensive clothing or sort of brands that weren't the aesthetic that I would want to wear, or were just inaccessible in price point. so I decided to start one. I visited over 150 different producer groups around India and Bangladesh. So saw everything from fair trade cooperatives to sort of large mass scale Primark factories, to spending time with the people that are still impacted every day by the collapse of Rana Plaza, and really spent time learning from them about how much clothing, like how many people's lives it impacts and how the effects that it causes. So we started Know the Origin basically working with a really small fair trade factory in South India called Mila Factory. So we started with 8 pieces and then it grew up to about 50. And then more recently, we basically, a year into running the business, we're looking at doing a pop-up shop and pulled together a lot of different ethical brands to collaborate, and people were asking, why can't we buy these all year round? So kind of sort of did a bit of a pivot, and Know the Origin became this like collective or marketplace of sustainable brands, and we still sell and create our own label. But yeah, it's part of what we do now. So yeah, our transparency, obviously Know the Origin in the name, has always been like core about knowing where products come from. There's a lot of sustainable brands out there that have amazing impacts and purposes, but actually don't know where their clothes are made, which for us is like a non-negotiable. This is one of the many pre-COVID pop-up stores that we've done. And each time we do a store, we try and communicate our transparency in different ways. So you can see in the shop window, we've got maps on where the products come from. There's tags on all the products showing where things come from. So talking about transparency, I wanted to just start with a common misconception that transparency doesn't mean ethical. There was a post out earlier this year from H&M that ranked on Fashion Revolution's Transparency Index, showing that they basically posted it and then deleted it shortly after, that H&M is the world's most transparent brand. And they'd kind of pitched themselves in the copy as being using a lot of like buzzwords and jargon, and this is like a huge rise that we're like seeing a lot of brands jumping on the transparency bandwagon. I think, yeah, for H&M anyway, to be turning over like levels of profit like they are in 2019, but then still not paying garment workers a living wage, yeah, I think speaks for me to the values and the actual integrity behind, or lack of integrity behind the brand. I think transparency needs to have evidence and action to kind of, yeah, show the impact of supply chains. For us, transparency is a really great tool for creating accountability, which then is sort of a process that creates change. Yeah, I think you can't just kind of claim a load of claim that you're ethical or sustainable. We look at a lot of brands' websites and speak to like hundreds of brands in the process of onboarding onto Know the Origin, and I think a lot of, yeah, there's a lot of like people that make quite bold claims about being sustainable without any information or certifications or accountability. So that's what transparency means for us. It's really needed because consumers are demanding a lot more of it. I think it's really important to recognise that not everyone is demanding more, because often we like to think that everyone, you know, really cares about transparency and it's like a super important thing, but actually this is still a very small amount of the population that does care about this level of information. I think what I find exciting is that in the food industry, you know, you're able to like that's something that's becoming normal. Like more people have done it, and it's kind of been this like tipping point, and now you expect it. If you don't see it, then you're kind of in a smaller group than if you do have it. I think the benefit of transparency is that it calls everyone to a higher standard, and one that's more accountable. So ways which you can be transparent. So you can either measure a business based on the scope or the milestones. So looking at what parts of the supply chain you're transparent with, so whether it's just your own business or your suppliers, indirect suppliers, and raw materials. And I think the raw materials part is the bit that's really challenging for a lot of brands to be able to, especially brands that aren't using like certified fair trade or got certified cotton. We see like very few brands that are able to get into that level of transparency, especially smaller brands, because they're buying fabrics from like larger mills. They're buying like leftover fabrics, which means that like the transaction certificate or the traceability certificate is given to the first brand that originally bought the fabric. So it's very hard to do that level of transparency as a small brand. And then ways in which you can measure transparency in terms of milestones. So which information do you share? Do you publish codes of conduct, standards, certifications, performance metrics? How traceable is your supply chain, or do you provide like full disclosure? Those are some of the ways that we look at brands. So I put alternatives here to transparency, but I don't think it's really an alternative. It's more of a like support or sort of steps on the way. So certifications are a great way to sort of help make the supply chain more transparent. I guess I did my dissertation on certification, so I won't bore you with it, but I know way too much about get way too excited about these, but basically there's like thousands and they're really confusing. Very few of them tell the full story of a product, and kind of the effectiveness of certifications is definitely limited by consumer knowledge. They're a really good thing to have, but it's definitely part of it sort of allows consumers to buy something and feel that like pat on the back or like guilt appeasement. And then reporting, so there's sort of a huge decline in consumer trust and big progress with the Higg Index, but there's still no global standard for how to produce garments ethically. I think, and very little or no guidance on how to produce them in a transparent way. We've got to remember that with reporting, I think a lot of brands try and create these big long PDFs, but we do live in a very instant culture, so we need to look at ways of creating this information more accessible. Transparency, I think the most powerful impact of transparency for us is that it's been, it really anchors like consumer trust. I think nowadays like people's values are very different and quite polarized, and kind of just being transparent and giving people all the information then allows them to make the decision on like what is ethical, what is sustainable for them. And I think unless transparency is the normal, it really allows like exploitation to hide when we're not being like kind of upfront about where things have come from. It's not a single marketing campaign, but it's something that happens over time. By sort of, you can build trust through communicating your practices, showing product proof, and really talking a lot about your brand purpose, and so the customer can then decide whether it aligns with them. I think something I would say, as 5 years of being in it, it's really hard. As much as I would love to say like this is the perfect brand, they nail it, no one is perfect, but I think you just have to start, and it's a constant like evolution of adding and developing and changing the way you do things. Some just tips on how I think you can become more transparent. So really thinking about when you're producing a product, visualizing the supply chain, collecting any data that you can from suppliers, and being quite clear about that before you start kind of placing orders. Using third-party certifications and independent trade unions on the ground. Monitoring production in person, or if you're not able to do that, using someone on the ground that can, like an agent. And I think as well, in terms of like communicating that information, like it's really important to ask consumers what they want to see, because I mean, you can bombard someone with heaps of information, but if it's not relevant, it won't, land correctly. I think just being really clear about your intentions, sharing your problems and challenges, sort of explaining to customers that it is a work in progress, it is something that you're continually developing. I think where you can go above and beyond with information on specific ethical points, I think that can be really useful. I think of the messaging around transparency, just making it really human. It needs to build trust. I kind of think of it like how you would want to talk to another person. That's how you want to be spoken to. So like being someone that's like humble, or admitting when you get things wrong, I think is really important. Offering unprompted information, sort of building this reputation for honesty in everything that you do, like right through to your customer service, to your packaging, accepting responsibility when things go wrong, sharing, what the limits are that you have as a brand, especially as a small business. You're not going to have thousands of pounds to put behind, pioneering the best new sustainable fabric. I think being really clear about what you're promising to do, and explaining if you're not able to do that, why. And just being really clear on what you stand for. For us, we have a set of standards. So all the brands that are on our platform, we basically we have 20 different standards that go across people, planet, purpose. So we measure brands on things like, are they vegan? Do they reduce waste? Do they use, do they get the equality standard? All these different sections that I could talk about for a very long time, but there's lots more information on our website. And every brand that we onboard basically has to fill out a very long-winded 4 or 5 hour Google Doc that basically they submit where their products come from, and then provide proof for each of these standards. So that's how that side of the business works. Something that I'm finding super interesting that seems to be resonating a lot more with customers than I think some just kind of bombarding people with supply chain information is the pricing transparency. I think a lot of people engage with numbers and seeing, I guess, that they're getting a good deal almost, or that it's fair in a numerical sense. So I think that's a really exciting trend that's taking transparency, I guess, one step further. I've just put together these questions that I thought were kind of interesting that we've been asked a lot recently over Instagram and in comments, because I think it's good to see what specific customers are asking for. So we're getting asked a lot about what's in our product, what's not in it, where are the ingredients from, where's it been made. We've been asked very rarely, only a handful of times, sort of specifically who made it, but that is something that we are seeing more. Sort of especially around a lot of the zero waste beauty products, we get asked a lot about why ingredients are in products, what's changed when products get updated, how does this differ from other products on the high street. I I think this top section of questions, like how do I use this product, how can I misuse this product, how can I dispose of this product, is something that we're definitely seeing like go through the roof. There seems to be a lot more people engaging in like plastic-free living, as opposed to I guess from the rise of things like David Attenborough's like documentary on climate change. So people are coming at it from Netflix films a lot of the time, because I guess it's quite an accessible way to understand and learn more about climate change. Yeah, so they're just some of the questions. And then just kind of to close, the biggest trends that I'm kind of seeing within transparency is that I get a lot of brands are spending a lot more on incorporating sustainable offerings, but are really struggling to gain trust. I think transparency is an amazing tool to allow you to cut through the noise. I think the kind of age group of like 18 to 35 really see themselves as human. More than ever, they're not aligning with specific religions or genders or geography. They're a lot more fluid. So I think kind of being real and having that like brand voice that can sort of talk to someone more like a friend, I think is really important. I think being transparent allows you to share a lot more of the sustainable aspects of your brand with someone, so that they can then pick the things that impact or they care about most to tell other people about. Yeah, I guess the other big trend we see within transparency is blockchain companies. There's a huge amount of them starting, as you'll hear from Jessie later. Provenance is obviously the biggie. It's definitely the future. I think for us right now, it's quite challenging as a small brand to kind of get all of our supply chains onto there, just because I guess there's no set incentives at the moment for suppliers to do that, and it's quite a big onboarding process sometimes. Yeah, I think the technology sometimes, just with like Gmail and opening tech packs, can be challenging for like smaller producer groups in an area where Wi-Fi is rubbish, in the middle of a small farming village in India. So I think for us, it was just really hard to try and sort of get producer groups onto there. And so we were having to like input a lot of that supply chain data into the back end, which kind of meant that it was the same as having it on our website. So I think there's like, yeah, I guess it's something that's like evolving and changing, but that I guess has been some of the biggest challenges why we kind of opted for, yeah, as our first step as a small brand, just doing it ourselves. And then that's something that I guess we want to invest a lot more in the future. I think the third and final trend that we just see is it won't be a choice as to whether you choose to be transparent as a brand. There's more and more ethical brands. I have a spreadsheet with like over 1,000 that have started in the last year. So as more kind of are started, in order to stand out, like, and kind of cut through the noise, like they'll need to have really high levels of integrity. Yeah, so I think having transparency really builds that. Yeah, so that's me. Thanks so much for listening.
Okay, thank you so much, Charlotte. Thank you, it was a wonderful presentation. We are slightly running over time, so I can see there's lots of great questions in the Q&A section. The top one about identifying how we can identify greenwash, I'm going to ask all the panelists at the end. But we're going to skip to Jessie now. And Charlotte, in the meantime, if you want to, you can answer some of these questions by typing the answer, the ones that are addressed particularly to you. You're able to type the answer to people in the Q&A box. So I don't know if you want to do some of that. But right now we'll go to Jessie, who's gonna talk to us about some of the tech side of transparency. So thank you, Jessie.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Charlotte. Such a big fan of what you're doing at Know the Origin. So hi, everybody. My name's Jessie. I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to me, and then I'm going to share a presentation, which hopefully will bring to life a little bit more about what we're doing at Provenance. I'll just share a few links for you guys in the chat. So as I'm talking, if you want to have a dig around, if you're like me and want to have a dig around on the internet while someone's talking, then go for it. There's some links in the chat. So yeah, I'm Jessie. I kind of bring the tech geek side. Please don't all run away. I'll try and keep it friendly. I started my career actually in garment manufacturing, working for American Apparel, who are no longer with us, but had some quite interesting kind of ethical manufacturing of clothes in downtown Los Angeles. Lots of other problems as a company, but I learned a huge amount about supply chains, how products are made, and yeah, really fell in love with the idea of transparency. It really posed wonderfully against my hatred of advertising, which I just think, yeah, seems to be set up to design to make us buy stuff that we don't want. Transparency for me seems like the modern day antidote. Let's buy into true stories. Let's buy into the reality. But yeah, I actually started Provenance. I was doing a PhD in computer science, looking at the very nerdy topic of Bitcoin and its applications in supply chains. So I was fiddling around with the idea of using a blockchain, which is essentially a new type of data system that sits underneath the cryptocurrency Bitcoin, in order to track products and their impact credentials through supply chains. So this was back in 2013. And yeah, Provenance really emerged as a side project and now a business. Initially looking very much at blockchains and their applications in supply chains. We've actually moved and kind of pivoted a bit as a company to really focus our attention on the area that we think really needs the most work, which is in helping create credible transparency to enable a kind of fruitful relationship between brands and consumers. So I'll just share my screen and give you guys a bit more info on what we're up to. Maybe could somebody let me know that that's possible to see? I hope so. I think it's
yeah, we can see that, Jessie. Yeah,
great, perfect. Okay, cool. So yeah, hoping to kind of keep this presentation really focused around the theme of how we can make transparency meaningful, as that's really is our bread and butter at Provenance. It's really what we do. So just wanted to start with kind of this year and what we've seen. I think coronavirus and the insane pandemic that we've experienced has, I think, revealed a dystopia for us, that we were living in this society where we were just consuming a huge amount, not realizing how interconnected we were. And actually, I think there's been some positive to come out of this year, a whole lot of negative, and I absolutely understand that this has been a dreadful year for many, but perhaps there is some tiny silver lining in that people have noticed kind of things like cleaner air. People have really realized that their consumption habits are connected to a very long and complex chain of millions of people and lots of different places around the world. That kind of interconnectedness that only a virus can help you realize, I think, has actually helped people see that we're interconnected in so many other ways. And particularly in consumption. And I think we're seeing an appreciation that many people want some of these societal changes to continue, and a consciousness has maybe started to arrive, which is been really, really great to see. So what do we actually do at Provenance, and kind of in the light of all of that? So essentially what we're here to do is to use technology to enable what we call impact-led commerce at scale. So we recognize very much that there are many brands and retailers who are trying to do the right thing and are helping to want their shoppers and customers to pick products that do have a positive impact on people and planet, or at least making meaningful progress towards that. But what we saw is that people were enabling this through lots of a myriad of different ways. So retailers might be sending Excel spreadsheets to brands to fill out with lots of data. Brands might be sending spreadsheets to suppliers to get information. Lots of different tools being used by supply chain managers, sustainability teams in order to enable internal transparency. But that information very rarely made it into the hands of citizens. It occasionally got published through a CSR report, useful to shareholders, but did that data actually get into the hands of commerce? Was it actually powering how we choose products on a particularly kind of digital platforms where you've got such a fantastic opportunity in order to nudge and change behavior? So our purpose at Provenance is to enable impact-led commerce and the kind of engine for enabling that, so that transparency, we can create transparency that's good for you, but also really, really good for society. And for us, there's sort of three pillars of transparency that are very important that we exist to enable. One is consistency, and we're seeing brands being more transparent, which is fantastic. But if everybody talks about things in a completely different way with a completely new set of icons, it isn't very helpful, right? And certifications have helped us get a long way, and we absolutely need them. But there's lots of other things that we need to make transparent in order to tell a complete picture. So what we're trying to do is to help with that consistency, so that when you see somebody claiming recyclability of packaging, it means the same thing every time you see it on the internet, rather than different things every time you see it on the internet, like today. Comprehensiveness is really important. So Provenance is really trying to help create transparency that's not just a claim, but it's a claim that you can dig into, you can see what it means, the standards it meets, and also you can gain access to more information and data from independent third parties in order to help educate you on what these things really mean in situ. So it doesn't matter where you are shopping on the web, you can actually dig into that rabbit hole in situ and find out that information. And then the third most important thing, which I think has come up already through Charlotte's talk, is what we help with, and it's really what the majority of our customers come for, is credibility. So there's one thing making a claim about your product being better for the world for some way, shape or form, but what we need is credible claims, and integrity is really the next most important kind of battlefield for transparency. We know brands are all purpose driven and they're all telling stories about sustainability. That's happening. The next thing is telling credible stories and having that integrity to back up those claims. And so a lot of what we do at Provenance is about helping bring credible data together from across organizations in order to be able to make claims that can actually be verified and defended against, rather than something that actually is not really credible at all. So those kind of three pillars for us are the key ingredients for creating transparency that doesn't only work for one ethical consumer, but actually works to create a kind of system that can enable brands to be held to account, and for businesses and citizens to collaborate on a system that really works at a societal level rather than just an individual consumer level at the point of sale. So sitting behind Provenance is something we've spent a long time working on, which is an open source framework for information. So essentially, in order to enable this consistent, comprehensive, credible transparency, we have to have a standardized way of doing that. And so we decided to create an open framework. So it's fully open source. Anyone can use it. You don't need to even work with Provenance to use it. But what we're doing is kind of constantly making this framework better. So this includes lots of reputable standards, different certifications, bringing in different auditors, verifiers, in order to create a kind of constantly living, but kind of something that everyone is collaborating on, a framework that's designed for transparency for brands. So there's many frameworks that are designed for transparency through corporate social sustainability reports, designed to report to shareholders or whatever. This is actually very much for brands. So this is how a business communicates to a citizen. How do we do that in a unified, consistent way? So yeah, essentially we've built this framework that works across many industries. The majority of our work has been in the food and drinks industry, where transparency is potentially been the larger imperative, but absolutely extends to beauty, personal care, fashion, and we're also at the moment looking at something in furniture as well, which is great. So open source living, everybody can contribute, people can help us bring in better standards where needed, but it just really creates that kind of unified language, and this is really the backbone of what is enabling Provenance to function. How we actually help brands use that is we run a consultancy which helps businesses to understand the opportunity for transparency. Many brands are right at the beginning of their journey on opening up data to their customers. They may have been opening up data for many years through their CSR reports, but actually haven't really taken that communication over to citizens, but are now realizing there is an imperative to do so. So we help them with a kind of consulting offer in order to help them understand and frame that business case. But the majority of our business comes through powering transparency experiences through our platform. So this acts like a kind of content management system, mostly used by brand and marketing people in the organization, but connected into supply chain and sustainability teams. So we've noticed there's lots and lots of tools that help businesses internally with internal transparency, what's going on in your supply chain. But actually what Provenance is really focused on is helping you take that data, gain the assurance you need on it, and then publish it. We really think that data needs to be out in the world. We have a kind of sunlight is the best disinfectant ethos. If we don't know and have public data related to how products are created, it's going to be very difficult for us to put pressure on companies, hold them to account, or really push companies forward to do better, because we don't even know what they're doing. So Provenance is very focused on this publishing element, getting the data from these internal tools into the outside world in this way that's consistent, comprehensive, and credible. And very much a part of Provenance is this kind of provability. So these claims that we help power that exist, off pack or through a kind of e-commerce experience, are all clickable. You can find out more information about what they mean, but most importantly, you can see the verification, the proof of how they came about. So we create a kind of like digital proof on different impacts and sourcing information that can live anywhere in the web. So you can embed this information into an e-commerce site and see that proof that the brand actually is supporting biodiversity, and you can actually see that it's been assured by the third party that is that's verifying this on the other side. And it just creates this kind of unified language that enables people to trust in this information. The kind of I guess we're the anti-greenwash tech engine is what lots of people call us, because with all of these claims that comes with this kind of consistency, comprehensiveness, and the credibility right there in situ when you're looking at the product. So where are we now? So we've been on an interesting journey. Provenance was my side project for a long time, then took over my life in 2017. And we've been working very much as an independent organization, powering transparency, both kind of internally and more recently, much more externally, for businesses, some of the kind of largest groups of brands in the world. And this is where we focus our attention. It's where the impact potential is so enormous. And none of these brands are perfect, but the progress potential is absolutely enormous. So by helping them open up information on their supply chain, on their impact, we're driving that accountability and driving them to make more progress. There's nothing like being open with your supply chain 1 year in order to put pressure on you, creating more initiatives and more openness in the next year. And that's what we're constantly doing with our customers, is really driving them to put effort into their supply chains, into the impact they're having, so that next year they can come out with more and more transparency, kind of constantly sharing more and more information, and also more and more weaving this into their marketing. For us, we see how a brand talks has to include real-time stories that have credibility from their supply chains, from their impact initiatives. And so doing that really requires a software solution to ensure that you can do that at scale, real time, across millions of products. So a few examples of what we do, in case that was gibberish for many of you, because I know a tech engine in the back end is not quite as understandable as many things. I just want to share a few little case studies of things we've done. So first one is Cult Beauty, which is an online beauty retailer. And we've been working with them. Currently, we're working with 45 of the brands that they sell. You can see some of them on the screen here, like Ren, Lumity, Mara, and growing, actually. So we've actually onboarding another kind of 45 at the moment. And this was really about setting kind of this, helping create this new standard for transparency for commerce for the beauty industry. Cult Beauty didn't want to create another set of their own icons and their own sustainability credentials and give PDFs and Excel spreadsheets to brands to fill in. They wanted to use a platform that could scale and work across the entire industry in order to drive more sustainable behavior across all the brands. So we worked with them to extend out the transparency framework to include all of the different relevant elements for beauty, create these digital badges that can filtrate through their whole website, but also through the brand's e-commerce as well. And then in the back end, we're running this engine that helps the brands to share the information real time through to the retailer, and also ensure that it comes with all of the verification and assurance from third parties already checked, fully wired together. So actually this just becomes an engine for more and more transparency to exist through their system. So we started with Cult Beauty, and we're going to be expanding to other retailers across the beauty industry, and lots of brands. So essentially this becomes one network of transparency acting across the industry. And then the competition becomes on impact rather than how fancy your icons are. And that's really what we want to do, ensure that actually this is really about how many proof points and how much impact you're creating, and looking at how we can really embed that into the web. So we're already doing like a search index and things like that on their site, but we've also been looking at sustainable swaps. How can we nudge people towards more recyclable products if that's something they're interested in? So using e-commerce as an engine to kind of create change through this information. So it kind of shifts to actually really being a core part of how you might navigate or get nudged through the shopper journey. Another example of some work we've done is with Napolina, which you can see provenance transparency experiences off of all of their 3 million cans of Napolina in your local supermarket. So this has been a great one, really interesting part of the Princes group. They wanted to be voluntarily more transparent on their social impact. The tomato supply chains have some really big challenges. There is, a huge amount of forced labor and things like that going on in tomato supply chains. We've been working with Princes and the Napolina brand for over 2 years now, and they have been working long before that in order to kind of really ensure that they have the credibility there and that they have put the care and attention into ensuring they know who they're sourcing from and the standards, social impact standards that they have audited against. So our job was really about coming in, making sure that information was all credible, and then offering that information up to the consumer, not just the consumer, but also to all citizens. This was very much for them, not just about attracting a new kind of shopper. This was actually about really enabling the whole company to be proud. So the people that work there to be proud to work for this brand and see what they're doing is being right there on the forefront on pack. But also, talking to NGOs, to journalists. So it's like, look, this is our first step, is to making this information open and accessible. And it's very much, this is a program. Transparency is very much a journey. And for us in our work with Napolina, this was the kind of the first time for sharing this kind of information about tomato supply chains. And I think it was a bit of an industry first. But this is now, we're looking every quarter, what can we improve? What more data can we bring? How can we make this more and more assured and more transparent, all in a kind of a format that's portable, can be used by others to inform how they think about the brand. So yeah, just a few examples of what we're doing. And yeah, I guess this doesn't quite cover everything, but and I'm sure there are questions. But if you'd like to reach out and have a chat with me and my team and learn a bit more about the tech and what we're trying to achieve, still got an awful long way to go. The scale of what our ambition is huge, and we still see ourselves as very much at the beginning. So would love any thoughts and comments. But thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you so much, Jessie. That was fantastic. Right, I did say we'd try and do some direct questions, but we are going over a little bit, so I'm going to shoot straight over to Rob from Ethical Consumer. Rob, if you could try and finish close to 3, so we've got lots of time to ask these questions to people, that would be great. So over to you, Rob.
Oh, Alex, just cut across me by speaking over me is much the best way, because I can't read all the chats at the same time as speak. Right. Hi, everyone. Like the others, I'm going to share the screen and baffle you with slides and all this kind of stuff. So let's just have a go and see if that works. Give me a shout if you can see something. And now I am going to do the slideshow.
Yeah, we can see that, Rob. You're good.
So yeah, listening to who I've cut, when you're speaking last, you're thinking, is everyone going to say what I'm going to say already? And maybe they do a bit, so I might rattle through some of these. But in a sense, we've started with quite specific, looking at transparency and real action, and I'm going to bring sort of ethical consumers experience at looking at it over 30 years and zoom out a little bit. So we're kind of taking a big overview rather than looking in quite so much detail, but I think it can help answer the question how to make transparency meaningful in under 15 minutes. So let's give it a whirl. These are the things that I'm going to talk about. They're about 16 slides. Shouldn't be too long. Some graphs too. So this is the Nike boycott, my first slide, and in a sense we see supply chain transparency from our point of view. Ethical Consumer was involved in the first boycott campaign in the 1990s. It ran for about 8 years. It was huge and all over the front pages everywhere around the world about trying to make the company responsible for its supply chain, and it initially didn't want to. However, as a result, one of the kind of settlements between the boycotters and Nike itself was it chose to be transparent. And this was quite early on. We were talking about 1999, 2000, almost before the internet, this was happening. And so Nike was one of the very first big global brands to go, we're actually going to publish our supply chain and tell you all about it. And in a sense, so I went on the Nike website last night, and they're still doing it now. And you can get a map of all the Nike suppliers. And here's Indonesia down here. And you can see there are 25 factories here in this little part of India. And you can zoom in and see each individual one and the streets they're on and all this kind of stuff. And it can, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Live messing about. Let's see if I can just move this little element of the screen. But you can actually see they've got, 233,000 workers in Indonesia. That's a lot of them. So there is detail here. It's not necessarily all the detail that we'd want to see in 39 factories, about 5,000 in each factory. They're a big old thing going on. That's just Indonesia. They've got this thing for the whole world. So you can zoom in, you can go to Nike's website and have a look. And this was a result of pressure. So it was under a lot of pressure. It was losing a lot of money, and it needed to open up to give credibility, because its credibility was plummeting. And so that was a result of campaigning that generated this kind of first big open transparency in a clothing sector company. So the next one is a similar story. I'll rattle, this is kind of partly just to say this isn't all about clothing. Apple had a similar thing with Foxconn. Again, it wasn't a very transparent company. It was front page news for a few months. Its share price was plummeting. And so now you can get a spreadsheet with all its, this is just a little extract from its supplier list. Interestingly, I couldn't find Foxconn on there. I looked between FOSTER and Fujikura and couldn't find it there. So there's another question as to are they putting everything in their transparency or leaving out the bits that are inconvenient? But we'll move on quickly to the next one. So it's not just pressure around poor workers' rights campaigns that are generating transparency as a way of trying to rebuild trust with consumers. The same stuff is happening in environmental areas. A big one that we all know about is Greenpeace's campaign around palm oil. And there they are dangling, a banner around on some Unilever staff here. And again, in 2018, after an 8-year campaign to get transparency, Unilever are now publishing, this is all their palm oil mills, which even have a latitude and longitude. You can go and find them on Google Maps, presumably, with all that stuff. These are, and where they're located and the names of them. There are some kind of worrying parent companies like Wilmer there for people who know about this stuff, but they're being transparent, which enables the discourse to kind of move to a higher level. And again, this is another example of environmental campaigning that has forced transparency out of reluctant companies. This was a campaign Ethical Consumer was slightly involved in, done by these guys called Changing Markets, looking at viscose and the factories polluting the rivers. And we now have kind of lists of these companies are best in disclosing their factories, and these ones aren't playing and all that stuff. So it's the kind of role of campaigning in forcing transparency, and it's the kind of breakdown of trust between consumers and the brands that are driving a lot of this. And, you know, we've seen a little bit about what super ethical brands are doing, or more ethical brands are doing, and where the best behavior is. As I was saying, I'm not particularly impressed with what Apple are doing. They're doing it kind of under pressure. We often use Nudie Jeans as an example of somebody who does it well. And you can go on their website here, and a bit like Nike, you can see they've got these 3 factories in Tunis, and you know, they give you a lot more detail. They talk about the factory, they show you some pictures, but most importantly, they have an audit summary there. And you can click on the audit summary, and I just picked out a bit here that's a bit small for you to read, but actually, you know, the things that we could improve to find. So this is Nudie, who we all think is super ethical, you know, and it says not all the interviewed workers are aware about their rights pertaining to CBAs. That's the collective bargaining agreement. So this is around the trade union rights, the wages, bonuses, and safety. So this is quite serious stuff that they're actually talking about. And it's when we see companies actually holding up their hands and going, look, we know there's a problem there, but we're going to tell you about it rather than you telling us about it, as a way of showing that we're on it, if you see what I mean, and we're tracking it. So we do look for you know, disclosure of stuff that isn't all just a nice, exciting story. So that was what businesses are doing. So businesses are being forced to be transparent, if you like, by, you know, just alarm at what's going on in their supply chains, really. So the governments are playing an interesting role in this space too. And transparency isn't just about businesses choosing to do it because they want to. Sometimes it's forced on them by governments, and this can be a good thing. And, you know, very first, you know, it was, you know, governments, you know, companies could put any old financial report, and then governments realized that actually you need to kind of create some rules and structure about how companies report financially. Otherwise you get all sorts of financial abuse, and this is you know, the railway mania of the Victorian age, and there's a train called speculation driving over a cliff with everyone's money, because the companies aren't really telling you the truth about how good they are and what they've got. And so the governments very early on realized that they needed to intervene in markets to set standards around particular parts of behavior. 100 years ago, it was around financial stuff. Now it's much more around ethical issues. You know, here's greenhouse gas reporting. We now know that this is apart from a government website, you know, quoted, you know, from April 2019, quoted companies must report on their global energy use, and large businesses must. So this is global. This is energy all around the world. If you're a global business, and large businesses disclose their UK energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. There are lots of specific rules about how you're meant to do that, and this is rolling out across Europe. This is part of European regulations. So all big companies are being forced to be transparent around this. And an ethical consumer, we have to learn how to understand and interpret all this data. And this is a final one. You know, again, the government, you know, the Modern Slavery Act is an interesting case in point. This was, in a sense, an attempt to force transparency through regulation. And, you know, we've seen, and this is again from a campaign group that watches it. And it goes, even though companies are meant to report on Modern Slavery Act, only 29% of the 10,000 statements that they've looked at are meeting the legal requirements. So actually the majority of companies that they're looking at aren't even meeting the legal requirements. So governments can try and enforce transparency, but it doesn't always work that easily. This next slide is just about the role of consumers in civil society. I've nicked quite a bit from Fashion Revolution, who are kind of a transparency campaign. They spoke at a much earlier ethical consumer conference in their first year when they were getting out, and we worked a little bit with them. So we love Fashion Revolution. They do great stuff in this place, but they also, because they spend a lot of time. So I've taken quite a few quotes from them, and this one says, transparency enables others to scrutinize what companies say they're doing to address human rights and protect the environment. It means there's information available for which others, consumers, investors, lawmakers, journalists, NGOs, trade unions, and workers themselves can hold brands and retailers account for their policies and practices, especially when things go wrong, like the day it did at Rana Plaza. And they've said the information disclosed by companies needs to be accessible and detailed enough to take action. So this is how to make transparency meaningful. The devil is in the detail. You know, I'm in what consumers are doing in civil society, and so there's a huge raft of organisations out there doing what are in effect transparency rankings around the corporate sector. In an effort to drive up best practice, and we've got 3 here. Can't quite see that one of them's from Oxfam because of where that thing is heading, but this is Oxfam's supermarkets ranking around, and they've got a little transparency setting there. This is Know the Chain is forced labour globally across all these things. Again, these are brands here. Tesco are doing very well here, as well as Unilever and Nestle at the good end. And this is a Greenpeace transparency ranking around what companies are doing in the tech sector around environmental actions.
So Rob, if you could start finishing up fairly soon so we can get onto audience questions if possible. Excellent,
Alex. I did ask you to talk across me, and so that is fantastic. I will rattle through the last couple now. So I think, you know, it's the importance of asking the right questions. Ethical Consumer does our own rankings. Here are our 20 criteria, about half of which are based around transparency questions that we ask companies. Around this one, which is supply chain, we've talked a lot about today. We have some questions that we know go to the heart of whether you can spot a good company from a bad one. We ask them specifically whether they're talking about audit fraud and what they do to deal with it, and about other things like operating in countries where freedom of association is illegal. You'd be surprised how many companies have we support freedom of association in all our supply chains, but yet supply from lots of factories where it couldn't possibly happen. So we need them to be talking about this for them to demonstrate to us that they really know what they're talking about. So it's asking the right questions. You know, again, this is another asking the right questions one. This is Fashion Revolution's own transparency index. Again, you can see that although first tier manufacturers, 40% of them are now of the clothing brands are now disclosing their supplier lists. You move further down to the raw materials and it's a bit smaller at 7% there. So just 2 last slides going limits. So so the limits to transparency. This is again is Fashion Revolution. It's not a silver bullet. However, it provides a window which allows us to address them more quickly and collaboratively. So this is consumer, you know, this is campaigners, civil society and brands to get onto it quickly and do stuff about it. The limits so this is again, you know, Charlotte started off with this right at the beginning, you know, transparency, I forget what she said, but transparency does not equal sustainability. They might be disclosing lots of information. This doesn't mean they're acting in a sustainable or ethical manner. I think you used the example of H&M, didn't you, Charlotte? We know that the pursuit of endless growth in itself is unsustainable. However, without transparency, we cannot see or protect vulnerable people or the living planet. And so finally, final slide, you know, what can we do? Companies be transparent. So the feedback loops are an essential element of good management. And that's, you know, this is a principle of good governance from everything from supply chains to how you treat your staff and all this kind of stuff. So feedback is really important. Governments, we want governments to require transparency, ethical consumer on a much wider scale and to properly enforce failures to comply. And consumers, obviously, we should support transparent companies, but also support those groups like Oxfam and Greenpeace, and indeed Ethical Consumer, who are doing the monitoring. So there you go. I've finished now, and let's do some questions. I'll stop sharing too. Hang on. Sorry about going so quick.
Thank you very much, Rob. That was very speedy. Right, we've got lots of interesting questions that have come up. So some of which have been answered in the process, but I think some of them we should give some more time to actually speak to them as well. So there was a question that lots of people, it seemed, wanted answering. So, and I think probably all our panelists might have some sort of comment on this. So how can we identify whether a brand is using greenwashing or if it's authentically sustainable? So if we start with Charlotte on this one, and then I'll go to Jessie afterwards. So if you could just unmute yourself, Charlotte, and then.
Smooth.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so I reckon a big part of it is, you know, as we spoke about, do they post where they're actually making stuff? I think even if you walk down the high street, there's a very clear sort of, if you look in shop windows, there's a lot of brands that are making statements like, oh, by 2030 we will you know, use organic cotton, or it's looking at, I guess, the wording behind what brands are claiming. Is it something that they're going to do, or is it something that they've done? Because I think that kind of shows, yeah, the level of like integrity behind the brand, and yeah, whether it's something that they've like prioritized and they've actually made action on that already, or whether it's kind of quite a loose, in 10 years time we will pay everyone properly type claim.
Okay, great, thanks, Charlotte. Jessie, what would you say to that question?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's good it's come up, because I think yeah, we are going through a bit of a greenwashing nightmare at the moment, right? I mean, every brand is claiming to be purposeful and have some higher mission, and I think it's a big risk. Yeah, I mean, from our point of view, I think it's very difficult to tell if a brand is greenwashing or not directly, which is the whole reason why we created provenance, because if you see a transparency experience that's powered by provenance, you know it's using our framework, so the transparency will be materially relevant, and you know you can access the assurance behind that information. So that's the whole point of why we exist and why we work with brands, particularly big ones, in order to help them to reinforce that credibility when they really are doing something good. And then we walk away from the customers that want to work with us, but they're not doing something that's credibly transparent. So yeah, that's really why we exist. But I would say, other than that, in the brand's ecosystem, I wouldn't trust a huge amount. I would default to something like Ethical Consumer, who are doing the hard work for you to look through all of that information that you perhaps are not a trained eye to review. I would default to apps and scores generated by independents like Ethical Consumer.
Thank you, Jessie, and yeah, thank you for recommending us, of course. Rob, any comments on greenwashing? I'm sure you do.
No, I was going to say pretty much the same as Jessie, although probably not quite so shamelessly promoting our own product, if you see what I mean. So in a sense, the third-party standards like organic and fair trade exist to provide this assurance. So if you trust those standards, look for third-party audited standards. Because it's all really complicated, again, third-party, or independent specialists in the civil society sector, like Oxfam and the Chain and Greenpeace and Ethical Consumer. So there are many of us, not just us, doing this kind of high-level work of digging under it. The journalist specialist work, do look for those too. Yeah, so I agree.
Okay, great, thanks, Rob. I just kind of add to that discussion as well. I wonder if any of you want to comment on, because of course supply chains have got so long and complex, and some people might say that maybe bringing supply chains closer to where the products are finally used, such as bringing production here in the UK, is that a necessary part of transparency? Is that a good way to go? Is that something we might need to push for? Jessie, I'll start with you if you have any comments on this one.
Yeah, I think this is a really good, so really depends, I think, is the answer to this, which is not a very good answer. I guess just speaking firsthand from spending some time in some supply chains, I don't have a problem with global international supply chains, and for lots of things that's really the most efficient way forward, is to buy something from where it is the most efficient to produce. I think what I do have a problem with is when you go into many supply chains and you see the reality of what globalized supply chains means, which is often products, you know, traveling 3 or 4 times around the world to find the cheapest place to cut it, the cheapest place to grow it. That is when I really struggle to support globalized supply chains. Yeah, I mean, I think for many people, looking at a more localized approach makes sense, but I think it really depends on the product as to, yeah, whether that truly makes sense. It can also be a bit of a red herring, I think, in terms of impact.
Yeah, especially as this year, like there was obviously that another huge scandal of like Misguided and Boohoo. Their factories are just down the road from where our office is, and they're obviously producing in the UK but still not paying like living or minimum wages, and using like undocumented workers. And so I think just because it's produced in a country doesn't necessarily determine like the labor standards. Yeah, so because I think a lot of people always assume that something that's made in China is really bad, or yeah, but actually it's more about like the standards and the amount that people are paid, and as Jessie mentioned, the environmental impact of like how far it's traveled. I think making stuff locally is amazing, and it would be really cool if we could do that, but I think just practically, like, to pay people a living wage and to use like organic and fair trade cotton, for us to produce a t-shirt in the UK, it would cost us about £15-20, which yeah, isn't really an option in terms of surviving as a business for us. So yeah.
Okay, thanks, Charlotte. Rob, do you have any comments on more localized supply chains?
I would kind of agree with Jessie, I think, in that I think that you know, the idea of having supply chains closer to you so that you could actually see what was going on better was sort of blown out of the market by the by the Leicester experience. We know that working, you know, some of the brands that we work with, you know, Leicester was one of the hardest places to audit because of the threat of violence to the auditors. And actually, it was much easier to go and audit in China and other places. And so the idea that somehow local is nice and far away is horrible is a bit of a myth. And also, because of technology and because, you know, we can see a live webcam in a factory in Bangladesh if we want to, the idea that you can't actually see what's going on a long way away has kind of changed through technology as well. So I'd say probably it's not a silver bullet, producing locally to make production ethical.
Okay, great, thank you everyone. Yeah, we got some funny comments in the chat as well about even the Archers are running a story about undocumented workers. You know, when the Archers starts mentioning it, the problem becomes solved, so that is good. Right, there's a question from Rose that I think maybe we can probably everyone could give an example, but I'm going to go to Charlotte. It's because I think you might have a good idea. Can you give an example of audit fraud? Might that entail, or what does that mean?
I think Rob's spoken more about this, but well, audit fraud is where an audit is put through and it's false, or the documents are like changed, yeah, to make up facts on it.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a specific example, if anyone.
Do any of the other panelists have a specific example of what might entail audit fraud, or common types of audit fraud, perhaps?
I don't know if it's common, but I think there's lots of flaws to audits in general. Tends to be, you know, there are situations of corruption and collusion and things like that, which lead to audit results that are not accurate. I think there's lots of really exciting new technologies, particularly like worker voice technology. I think is really interesting. So actually directly talking to individual workers in factories via their mobile phone in order to gain real-time information, I think is quite an interesting alternative to some of the things that audits are looking for. But yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of flaws in it as a process, and but yeah, coming up with alternatives is very complicated. So I feel optimistic about technology's role there over time, in order to kind of help ensure there is more integrity in them. But I do think it's important that everyone is aware they're definitely not a perfect process.
Yeah, okay, great, thanks Jessie. Rob, did you have anything you wanted to add about audits and the...
No, not really. I mean, there's been quite a lot of academic study of the impact of social auditing and whether it's really generated change, and it has in some parts, but not in others, if you see what I mean. And we know, it's been good, well, goodish at health and safety, but it's been not so good. I think where you go in and you can see that there aren't fire exits, that's not easy to defraud, but it's very much less good on living wages and as a way of solving that, because I think it's quite easy to have a duplicate set of papers that you give to the auditors. It's much less easy to do that than to build to hide a fire escape and stuff. So there are issues there, and when we know that it has become systemic, partly because there's a lot of collusion between everyone who just wants to keep the prices down, and it's not the companies themselves aren't always clear on what they want. Do they want low prices or do they want ethics? They usually want both, which is not always compatible.
Okay, great, thanks Rob. We've got an interesting question that in the Q&A has actually been answered, but I'd quite like to voice it just to make sure everyone hears. So it's a question from Glenn, and he says, Bitcoin is an environmental disaster due to the processing power required to mine it and keep it secure. Is this not an issue with other blockchain technologies like the ones mentioned? So Jessie, I wonder if you could just talk about that a bit, and then I'll go to Rob or Charlotte if you want to add anything afterwards.
Yeah, please tell me if I go on a big philosophical rant about the decentralization of the internet and the impact that's going to have on the world. I'll try to keep this short. Yeah, so absolutely, Bitcoin is an absolute disaster for the environment right this second. Totally agree. And it's actually a reason we kind of pivoted a bit in our product at Provenance. So what I was doing for my PhD originally was using the blockchain to tokenize each individual material as it flowed through a supply chain, so that you had a kind of digital twin that sat on top of a blockchain that could flow through the whole supply chain. This is a terrible idea in general, if you're using a public blockchain with the amount of energy consumption it takes right now. Took me a long time to realize that the absolute level of energy required to enable it was absolutely enormous. However, I was thinking forward to the time, which is almost arrived actually for Ethereum, the blockchain we use when we move from proof of work, which is guzzling all that energy, to proof of stake, which has a absolute seismic shift in energy amount change. And that's been a very difficult technical challenge to solve for the Ethereum blockchain, and they haven't sorted it yet for the Bitcoin blockchain, where they're going through a slightly different process. But I knew that shift would happen eventually. I actually took a lot longer than I thought it would. But essentially doing those things today doesn't make any sense. So it's why at Provenance, actually, we really focus on the individual proofs at kind of the end of the chain related to the product, rather than tracking every single individual item. We don't do that anymore. In the future, maybe we will, but we don't do that now. All we do is store the kind of aggregate proof at the end. So proving this product has indeed passed these requirements on social impact and has the traceability. That is just the proof, rather than needing each individual item to be tracked. But yeah, so we fundamentally changed our product to ensure we're using way less transactions, and now it has. You should also just look at the energy intensity of going on a website to realize that actually the internet is also a big energy guzzler. But now it's actually much more on a par than it was before. But yeah, some really interesting developments are happening. This movement to proof of stake will actually mean this actually does become something that's viable and isn't an energy disaster anymore. And yeah, it's important to think deeply about the huge social change that something like decentralized power on the internet could bring. So it's quite important to rise above thinking about some of the short-term errors with something like Bitcoin in order to think about the bigger picture of what it could mean. I think it's important.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jessie. Rob or Charlotte, did you have anything to add to that?
No, not really. I mean, we know that, you know, some other, you know, the kind of the idea of a chain of custody from one end to the other of a supply chain, you know, has been long been kind of puzzling technologists from before blockchain, and RFID chips have been used by FSC, stuck in their logs and this kind of stuff on various experimental things. But nothing has really nothing has demonstrated that it's kind of just better at this stage, I think, than people just being honest, trusting each other and having rigorous systems to try and spot the charlatans, if you see what I mean.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rob. Right, just looking for some other questions. So we have one from Victoria, which is, how do we make sure that people don't use transparency as a license to buy and waste more stuff? Because I'd imagine maybe some people might actually be put off from buying stuff because they're worried about where it's come from and they don't know. So are there issues around that? Rob, I'll start with you this time.
Yeah, I think probably, I mean, in a sense, I think what we're hoping to get in an ethical economy is probably people buying less stuff, less often, that's better and that lasts longer. And in a sense, you know, it's very hard to pay people a living wage in your business without putting the costs up slightly, unless it's all going to shareholders. You know, so in a sense, a more ethical product is probably more expensive. It isn't always, but it's better quality and it's going to last longer. And transparency helps us get there, I think, but they're not that closely linked. But as I said in the original thing, transparency isn't sustainability, and there is a big issue about that. But, you know, transparency can't solve everything. It's part of a bigger puzzle, really, isn't it?
Okay, great. Anyone else? Charlotte, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I think that summed that up perfectly.
Okay, or Jessie, do you have anything to add? No, okay. We've got a question that appeared in the chat, which is an age-old question. Who audits the auditors? How does that work? Is there an issue there, and how do we get around that? Does anyone want to respond to that?
Do they? Yeah, it'd be good. I'm not quite sure exactly what they mean, but I could try and respond, because I think, well, unless there's more detail.
No, that's all I can see, and I guess it's the problem with you know, are there ever structural issues with auditors being you know, having incentive to give good answers? How do we make sure that that is not happening?
Yeah,
how do we know that they're doing good audits?
So a lot of how we're tackling this at Provenance, and we haven't solved any of these problems, it's just a big caveat, but how we're trying to solve them, I guess, is at the moment, auditors are not very transparent, right? They sit inside, they're commissioned by the company to audit their supply chain in order to help reduce risk. They very rarely make it into the public domain as a name. And I think what we're really seeing is how vital those auditors are, and the reputation of those auditors is really important aspect of transparency. It's a difficult one to change because it's not the way things have been done, but what we really try to demand through our experiences and working with our customers is that they make the auditors transparent, so you can see who has verified the information regarding I don't know, safety at a factory. Sometimes this isn't very popular, but we think it's the best way forward, and then the kind of credibilities of the auditors are now kind of a much more central part to your transparency. So that's kind of how we're kind of tackling this at the moment, is ensuring those auditors are on public record as part of the transparency experience.
Okay, great, thanks. Does anyone else on the panel want to respond to that?
Well, I could just, I mean, you know, problems with auditors are much wider than social auditing, and you know, Enron is the case in point that I won't go into here, but financial auditors have been too close to the companies that they audit to. I think on workers' rights issues in supply chains, when Ethical Consumer does a ranking of the quality of audits, we look to see whether there's the presence of NGOs or trade unions or other civil society organisations as part of the audit programme. and we give companies a better mark if that's the case. So we think that's one key indicator in human rights auditing. But there are other, there are other types of auditing. Again, with environmental auditing, we look for them to name the auditor and all this kind of stuff. So as with all transparency, it's about asking the right question.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rob. We're approaching the end of the session, but see if we can get one or two more questions in. Sophie from Ethical Consumer has asked, what about diversity? How do we approach transparency from an anti-racist perspective? What shouldn't brands be doing? And I guess maybe there's something in there as well in relation to are workers empowered by transparency too? Or that's what I'd like to add in. So does anyone want to respond to that question? Rob, do you have anything?
I mean, it's new territory, and we've not really seen a lot of reporting being asked around those questions. But I think those questions are going to come. I think they'll be added into the universe of things that people are going to ask. We know gender is often reported in the supply chain audits, but I think ethnicity is probably going to come along there too. And so, first of all, we need to know what's happening really before we can start to manage it. And my understanding is that it's not a core element in lots of reporting today.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Charlotte, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, like we definitely get asked about this a lot. Like we get asked like how many of the brands do we sell are owned by like Black or minority founders, and how many are owned by women as well. Yeah, so I think we do like publish on our website like the mix and the sales mix as well, and sort of do like publish the things that we are doing to like actively try and grow yeah, our offering. Yeah, but it's like another element of like growth and development that I think a lot of brands haven't fully got their head around yet. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Charlotte. And Jessie, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say that I think it's reporting on diversity and inclusion policies in your business is becoming standard, I think. I hope, judging by the amount of conversations we've had on that this year. And I think that the time has come. I think the pressure's already here to make sure you're doing that. And lots of our customers have been making sure they have all of the right policies and procedures in place to support that at an HQ level, so that they can be ready to report on that transparently moving forward. In the supply chain, I do think it's a little bit more complicated, but again, I mean, we're seeing brands acting on this now. It's not down the pipe. I think it's here.
Okay, great, thank you. So we've got a couple of minutes till the end, so I think we'll finish up now. We managed to make it through, I think, most of those questions. So thank you very much to all our speakers today, to Charlotte from Know the Origin, to Jessie from Provenance, and to Rob from Ethical Consumer. Thank you for people who are organising this week, and to Tom for doing the tech. Thank you all for coming and for taking part and for asking some really interesting questions. So please have a look at the other events that are going on both today and for the rest of the week. There's some really, really fantastic sessions that are going on. At the end of the week, we'll be sharing an evaluation with you by email, I think. So if you could please do that, especially as this is the first year we've done our conference in this way, over the space of a week and virtually. So it'd be really, really great to have your feedback, so we can improve things in future years if improvements are needed. So yeah, I think that is everything. So I hope you enjoyed today, and I hope we will see you at future sessions. So thank you very much.